I'm continuing the series that we're doing right now on the letter to the Ephesians this Shabbat. So open your Bibles. If you don't have a Bible, there are some on the back card over there. And we're looking at Ephesians. Why Ephesians now? As we regroup and we rebuild and we recommit after COVID, our goal again is to, you guys should know it by now, strengthen community. We want to strengthen bonds of friendship, mutual commitment with each other, and we're really working to come back together as a community after this very challenging time, a very hard time for a community over a year, and let's just come back together. My goal in this series is to begin to lay some foundations for a community theology, living out of a community-centered worldview inspired by life in Yeshua. That's the idea. So that's what Ephesians is all about, and that's why I've chosen this book. Paul is a big picture thinker. In chapters 1 through 3, he inspires us with the wonders of God's reconciliatory plan for all humanity, how he's going to bring all things back together for good. And this is just review for the big picture of the book. He chose Israel in love, predestined to be adopted as sons of God through Messiah's redemption and forgiveness of sins. Then through God's special relationship with Israel in the Messiah, those Gentiles who trust in Yeshua, Yeshua being Israel's Messiah, become joined to the promise of Israel. You see, co-heirs of Israel's chosenness in Yeshua through this good news. Big picture is that Ephesians is a message of peace and a message of reconciliation in the love of Messiah. And in chapter 4, which is where we are in today, Paul shifts gears and he says that we must live out God's redeeming work in the world together in community life. That's Paul's message. Spiritual maturity means healthy relationships where we live out God's great reconciliation every day with each other. It's humility, we've talked about, gentleness, patience, putting up with one another in love. Individuals, this was last time we talked about this, individuals are a part of a larger body, and unique giftings and talents and passions that God gives us as individuals are given for us to share to build and advance the community of Messiah. This is the beginning of this community theology that we're talking about. And we closed last time with Paul's message, if you want to live out God's larger work in the world, become a community builder. Now, let's keep going. Okay, so if you got your Bibles there, you can open them up. We're in chapter 4 of Ephesians, verse 17. And we'll just read a bit and then talk about it. So what we're going to unpack today, the themes, you can keep your eyes out for this, is we're going to unpack the old and the new self. The idea of the old and the new self in Ephesians. Verse 17. So I tell you this, indeed I insist on it in the Lord. Walk no longer as the pagans do, stumbling around in futility of their thinking. They are darkened in their understanding, alienated from the life of God because of the ignorance in them due to the hardness of their heart. Since they are past feeling, they have turned themselves over to indecency for the practice of every kind of immorality, greed, and more. However, you did not learn Messiah in this way. If indeed you have heard him and were taught in him, the truth is in Yeshua. And here's our section. With respect to the former life, you are to lay aside the old self, corrupted by its deceitful desires. Be renewed in the spirit of your mind and put on a new self, created to be like God in true righteousness and holiness. Okay, we're tracking? Old and new. What does Paul mean by old and new self? Let's start at the beginning of this passage with Paul's admonition to walk no longer as the pagans do. This is really interesting connection to the first half of the book. The Greek word here for pagan, that we translate pagan, is the same word that Paul uses for Gentile earlier in the book in a positive sense, ethnos. In chapter 3, verse 6, Paul says that in Yeshua, the Gentiles, ethnos, are co-sharers in Israel's life through Messiah Yeshua. But here in 4:17, he insists that these same Gentile communities no longer walk as the Gentiles, don't walk as the ethnos. Paul is putting teeth to his theology. Before trusting in Yeshua, these Gentiles were alienated from the life that God has given the Jewish people. Now, through Yeshua, these new Gentiles are brought into the life of Israel. Their change in identity is lived out in a change in the life of their community. Paul doesn't mean that these Christians become Jews and take on the specifics of Jewish life. We know that. It means that they draw their communal life from Israel's life, and they allow their hearts to become sensitized to the godly values that Israel is supposed to embody. Now, of course, Israel does not always reflect what it's supposed to be, right? Christians can sometimes live that life better than us Jews. But nonetheless, the Gentiles enter into the same or some degree of and share in what Israel's covenantal life is supposed to be. So the point is that who we share life with is really important. You become like the people you spend time with. Our Parsha today highlights this. When Moabite king Balak is unable to defeat the Israelites by cursing them, what does he do? He's very clever. He sends Moabite women to intermingle with the Israelite men. Why? Because when the Israelite men share life with the Moabite women in an intimate way, it would draw them away from life with God. It would make them worship other gods and do immoral acts, a life which is incompatible with God's life. And it worked. Similarly, Paul is reminding these new Gentile believers that they share in Israel's communal life. They must no longer practice as the other Gentiles. That life is incompatible with their new life. You see? So this helps us understand, I think, Paul's old self and new self in context. For the Ephesian Christian community, the old self was participation in pagan life, idolatry, greed, immoral acts. The new self is shared community life alongside of Israel, righteousness, holiness, that is new in Yeshua. Now, let's dig a bit deeper. How is this important for our Messianic Jewish community? Ecclesiologically, or in theological terms, Jewish followers of Yeshua the Messiah aren't moving from a pagan life to the life of Israel's election. We're already in Israel's election. Messiah is the great Jewish hope. When a Jew embraces Yeshua, he's not accepting a new hope, but a hope that he already has in Messiah, specifically in Yeshua. You see? So we might say that a Messianic Jew has a renewed life in the fullness of Messiah. That's in theory. On the ground, in reality, most of us Jews in America who embrace the Messiah, we're not living lives fully enlightened by the Torah. More often, Yeshua is bringing us back to our Jewish identity and a life rooted in Torah that might feel more new. And you can see a marked distinction between an old self and a new self. When Yeshua found me on the Appalachian Trail in the White Mountains, it was such a life-transforming experience that I recognized an old me and a new me within hours or days. It didn't mean that I became godly in a moment. Far from it. I think I'm still far from that. It's a journey. But for me, the distinction between old and new was first in my heart. I knew it was Yeshua, though I didn't deserve it. He found me. He rescued me. And I wanted more than anything else to live within his life. That was the heart. And within days, there was like a repulsion that I experienced towards negative language and swearing and things. I had a desire to read the Bible as if it were like water. And then I began to meet others who were walking with Yeshua and began to help me. And as Paul says, help me to learn Messiah. And very quickly, learning Messiah for me meant allowing myself to be caught up in community life with mentors and friends and accountability. Those are my early days at Ruach Israel. In a real sense, it was a new life, even a new identity, but really more me. So that's kind of part of how I see this in individual terms for me. But it's bigger than this. I wonder about what the old and new looks like for those of you who grew up in the faith. What it will be like for our children who have known Yeshua since before they can remember. Perhaps you can't so easily point to a transforming moment like you hear so many others talk about. You've just always believed, Let me lead this point by saying that I do think it's important that kids who grow up in the faith have some kind of transformation. That transformation should lead into community. In our family, we stress the importance of our younger children making what we call a life commitment to following Yeshua. but it should happen in the context of family and family within community. Later, immersion in Yeshua becomes shared community, a shared community moment. And then many of life's crossroads become decisive faith moments that are also, if we do it right, shared with community. Do you see? All of us need these regular, more mundane life moments as well, events where our faith is continually renewed and recontextualized, I think in a way appropriate for every different season of life or phase that we're in. But I think that growing up within the faith is actually how it's supposed to be. That should be normal. We should not assume that everyone needs a story of transformation from old to new. The old might not be something a person ever needs to taste. And really, this is where Paul's communal theology becomes critical if we really want to read this verse, I think, correctly. For Paul, it isn't the question at all. For Paul, the new self is not an individual thing at all. The word translated here as self is anthropos. It literally means human and can mean humankind. This is how we translated this word in the earlier chapter, a new humanity. So we might better translate this verse, put off the old humanity and put on the new humanity. And this reading makes sense for the Ephesians and their communities and others like it. They were pagans apart from God. Now they worship the God of Israel. They have changed the fundamental nature of their communal identity. They have changed their humanity. Put off the old self and put on the new self is not primarily about your individual faith experience or even your individual character. And even though we can read this verse into our own past and present like I have, really this verse is not about past life versus the time of your new salvation. These verses are about the life of a community that is experiencing salvation in an ongoing way together. These verses are about transformation of a community that is being renewed in Yeshua. So big picture for us, new humanity is ongoing participation in renewed community life in Yeshua. So really, whether you've had a darker past that you must flee from, or you have a moment to look back to or not, it isn't as important. What really matters is that you are living life with Messiah in his community now, and that you are maturing and growing and aligning your life more and more with his community life and helping others to do the same. That's how we put off the old and take on the new. So for Paul, putting on a renewed humanity is life in Messiah's community. Simple. The thrust of Paul's message in these verses is about what this community life looks like. In verse 20 that we read, Paul insists that the Ephesians, they did not learn Messiah through life in the world. Instead, they learned Messiah in new community life. What does it mean to learn Messiah? Paul is drawing from the Jewish practice of to learn Torah. For Paul, the key to Yeshua is Torah and Tanakh. You can't fully understand Torah without Yeshua, and you can't understand Yeshua without Torah. So to learn Messiah is part of learning Torah. It means to learn who he was, to learn what he taught, what he did. But more than learning ideas, we're learning his life. In an adult ed class that I took at Hebrew College, I was discussing Messianic Judaism after the class, and a Jewish man I was talking with said to me, I don't think I'd become a Messianic Jew, but I love to read things that Yeshua taught. And I love to read Paul because it's so meaningful. Tell me, in your opinion, is that enough? You know, just to like his teachings, is that enough? It was a really interesting question. Learning his teachings is great, but it isn't learning Messiah. Learning Messiah isn't even something you do and complete. It's living a life of devotion to Yeshua in shared community life with others who are also learning Messiah. You learn his life through the life of others by being together and watching and modeling and teaching and being corrected. It's a lifelong journey of becoming more like him together, his body. So you might ask, how am I learning Yeshua in my life? And we might ask, as a community, how are we learning Yeshua together? And I suggest that we need to be learning communities. We should be a community here at Ruach Israel that is a learning community. And actually, this Sunday, our board has our mid-year strategic planning meeting, and we want to ask some of these questions. Dave and I have been talking about an extension to the Maturing in Messiah class, a Chavruta program that would provide opportunity for study and accountability partner. We might say, to learn Messiah together. So let us know if it's something you're interested in. We'll be talking about it, and we'll see how it goes. But with all of this as a backdrop, Paul leads us into the specifics of life in Yeshua. And let me read this last part, verse 25. And this is how he culminates his argument. So lay aside lying, and each of you speak truth with his neighbor, for we are members of one another. Be angry, yet do not sin. Do not let the sun go down on your anger, nor give the devil a foothold. The one who steals must not steal. Instead, he must work, do something useful with his own hands, so he may have something to share with the one who has need. Let no harmful word come out of your mouth, but only what is beneficial for building others up, according to the need, so that it gives grace to those who hear it. Do not grieve the Ruach HaKodesh of God, by whom you are sealed for the day of redemption. Get rid of all bitterness, rage, and anger, and quarreling, and slander, along with all malice. Instead, be kind to one another, compassionate, forgiving each other, just as God has also forgiven you. Put off things like lying, stealing, greed, anger, quarreling, gossip. That's the old humanity. That's not learning Yeshua. Instead, in the new humanity, our Yeshua learning community must speak truth, build one another up, be kind, compassionate, forgiving. Where do all these values, where do these instructions come from? They come from Torah, of course. This isn't new for Paul. Life in Messiah's community is rooted in life in Torah. And the difference between the old life, if we really want to boil it down, the difference between the old and the new life, in simple terms, is that the old humanity is self-focused. The new humanity is community-focused. Old humanity is self-focused. New humanity is community-focused. Don't steal. Why? Because we're members of one another. And our relationships must be built on mutual trust and commitment. Excuse me. Be angry, yet do not sin. Why? Because nothing divides families and communities like anger and harshness. Instead, build one another up. It's really interesting. Paul warns against pagan immorality. When we think of immorality, pagan immorality, what do we think of? Sexual sins and partying. Not good, right? But here, Paul takes the immoral life in a different direction. He says, let no harmful word come out of your mouth. This includes social media, by the way, right? For us today, Paul is telling us that our communities must be characterized by God's life, something entirely different than what is in the world around us. We are to create a different kind of community life that should stand apart. Kindness is not a state of being, it's a community action. Be kind to one another. Compassion requires ongoing relationships. Forgiving each other requires putting up with each other, sticking it out through hurts and wounds in challenging times, taking responsibility for your own wrongs. Central to Paul's message is that in Messiah's community, we are not out for number one. Instead, we belong to one another. Do you hear that? We belong to one another. That's the glue in community. We say community glue. That's the glue. We belong to one another. An individually centered life comes or goes. It does this or that. It shows up or not. A community-centered life is family, where you're connected to the life of the community and your presence makes a difference for building others up. That means your absence also makes a difference. It leaves a space. It leaves a hole. And that's true at services. We miss you. And as we come back together, if you don't come, we miss you. On the ground at Ruach, it can be super practical. Show up, come, build. If you can't make it, that's okay. Give a heads up in advance. Tell someone what's going on in your life. Have a conversation about it. Don't just do it. It's a communal decision because we belong to one another. This is contrary to American society, isn't it? But we belong to one another. The community glue is that I don't see myself as an independent unit, but as part of a community. And if you aren't already, commit to one of the small groups that we have and grow more intimately. Keep up with what's going on in each other's lives. Pray for one another. Learn Messiah together. And at this Sunday's board meeting, Michelle, our director of community life, is going to discuss some small group ideas, possibly reinvigorating groups like the men's group or women's group, Shabbat dinners in homes. We've got ideas, good stuff of Jewish community life renewed in Yeshua. But we need you to own those ideas and to become part of it and to build it together. So to close, the big takeaway from our passage in Ephesians today, when Paul urges us to proclaim the good news, he's not just asking us to share a message of something that God did 2,000 years ago. He's asking us to become a community that lives differently, a community that embodies the message of the good news. And at Ruach, that is a renewed Messianic Jewish community where we are continually learning together to live his Jewish message, to love better together, to make mistakes together, to forgive together, to grow and to learn Messiah's life together. And that is community maturity in Messiah. So with that, Shabbat Shalom to you all. And I'm going to invite